Um, well, a more specific question about, the context of Mexico and maybe Latin America in general. It's the question of, how much this situation impact on our understanding of the relation between, non-Western art world and the Western art world, and the question again, coming back to so-called globalization, and can we imagine this impact has a influence on how we rethink the question of globalization?
The region is in a very weak position. In the last quarter of a century, even more, the way Latin America embraced the neoliberal process of globalization has implied that, on the one hand, the level of incorporation into city life and industrialization and the destruction of autonomous economies has been huge. Secondly, that a significant part, what used to be still more or less untouched nature, is in danger. And finally, that you have a population that has been impoverished, and not only economically. You have a population that has been spiritually, socially impoverished, because you have the arrival of consumerism in misery. You have the violence of social change, of late capitalism, in populations that don't understand where they are standing. So that gives rise to, for instance, the deadly combination of evangelicalism, right-wing military thinking in Brazil, and ecological mayhem. In places like Mexico, it's very complicated because we have a so-called left-wing government whose reaction is to practically strangle the public sector, and is trying to establish a relationship of dependence with the large population. So all that is very complicated. I'm in that respect, I think that on the one hand, there will be a lot of political tensions. It's going to be a very hot decade. There are sectors, even of the opposition of the left, that are becoming really desperate, and that includes the fact that they even think that violence can be justified and useful. Another part of it is that you have a population that has been impoverished in terms of the education, so they don't necessarily are taking the best choices, and that includes America. We have a real problem in which one of the results of neoliberalism is less enlightened societies, that when they take political decisions, they actually can make terrible mistakes. So I don't know what is it that we are going to do. Historically, artists and intellectuals have had an incredibly important role in the politics of the region, partly because they had to substitute disenfranchised majorities. They have represented, or at least both in terms of depicting and speaking for those that are left behind. Now, that's not necessarily the case, because there are priests, there are also populist leaders, whatever. My impression is that what we need to do in every one of these societies is to try to produce a very important alliance between forces that are trying to go beyond the idea of taking power to change the nature of the society. Ecological groups, indigenous communities, intellectuals, artists, people in universities, we need to become sort of a popular bloc, even sometimes just to control the so-called populist governments. Then it's clear that we will need to change the directions of development from numbers into quality of development. it's the brutality what developmental politics imply here, for instance, that the López Obrador government is committed to keeping the oil industry as one of its main goals, at the same time that everybody around the world is switching to alternative forms of energy, just because of a nationalist nostalgia and the inability to see what are the possibilities of actually changing course. And uh, the situation in that respect is very complicated. I would be very wary of imagining that something like a neo-indigenist mystic way of thinking will actually change for the good. Instead, one serious danger is that some of the local governments are going to use that kind of folkloric structure to actually modernize the lands of the indigenous communities against their will. Uh, all in all, maybe it's because I'm a historian. I try not to be a prophet. I just know that we have a really, really complicated task that is different, but not less, no less complicated than the trouble that Europeans have into assuming that the world doesn't gravitate around them, that they will need to actually change their policies around the world because America is not their ally, and that the possibilities of closing borders are not only impossible but also completely wrong.